is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. The topic that we'll be exploring today together, our sugya is Chullin Daf Lamed Gimel, is going to be the relationship between Jewish and Gentile law, or Jewish law and the Noahide laws. And really the question that we'll be exploring is it ever easier to be a Jew than it is to be a Gentile? In other words, are there any laws that apply more strictly or more stringently to Gentiles than they apply to Jews? Hopefully that'll take us into a maybe slightly broader conversation about, the particular what is particular about the Jewish covenant with God and how that relates to, the covenant that God has with all of humankind, and whether we as Jews are also kind of part of that broader human covenant as well. So let's jump in. Will be our sugya in Chullin gets into this question by way of a discussion of the innards, particular kinds of internal organs that we won't precisely go into the details, but that are sort of considered to be taken already not really part of the animal anymore, separate from the animal from the time of shechita, but before the animal dies, right? We all know that there's a little bit of a time lag when an animal gets shechted between the shechita and the animal's actual death. And so the question is going to be, what is the status of those organs? Are those organs treated like aver min hachai, like an organ taken from a living animal, and therefore asur? And what we're going to explore together in the sugya on Lamed Gimel explores the possibility that the answer might actually be different for Jews and for Gentiles. So let's jump in. Amar of Achabar Yaakov, Shema minami Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, mezamnin Yisrael b'nei me'ayim, ve'in mezamnin ovdei kol chavim b'nei me'ayim. So Rav Achabar Yaakov infers from a previous statement of Reish Lakish that actually, the answer to that question would be different for Jews and for Gentiles. For Jews, it would be totally fine to eat the b'nei me'ayim, these innards. Whereas for Gentiles it would not. My Tama, the Gemara asks, why is that? Yisrael de b'shchita talia milta kevan de ika shchita me'alita ishtrele. So Jews, right, are forbidden from eating in nevela. In other words, right, Jews have to perform a kosher shchita on any animals that they're going to eat, and as such, the shchita itself is what renders the animal permitted. The shchita happened while these organs were still, functioning parts of this animal's body, and therefore they're considered no different from the rest of the animal's body, and therefore permitted to eat. But of but Gentiles don't have to perform shechita, right? A Gentile can eat a nevela, and therefore, right, what is the moment that determines whether or not an animal is going to be permitted for a Gentile to eat? It's the moment of death. And because these particular internal organs are not considered to be part of the body before, separate from the body before the moment of death, right? We're going to treat them like aver min hachai, and therefore forbid the Gentile from eating them. That's what Rav Achabar Yaakov is proposing here. So just to kind of review that really quickly, according to Jewish law, shechita is what renders the animal permitted. Therefore, organs that are sort of separated between the shechita and the death are going to be permitted, and that's going to be a heter for these b'nei me'ayim. Whereas under Gentile law, it's death that renders the animal permitted, such that those organs that, right, the b'nei me'ayim, which are the organs kind of that are not considered part of the body, between shechita and death, are going to be forbidden. That's the technical background, and now we're going to get into the maybe broader conceptual question at stake here. So Rav Papa, who hears Rav Achabar Yaakov proposing this inference from Reish Lakish, responds, Amar Papa, Havayativna kameder of Achabar Yaakov uvai de'imale mi gamidi deli Yisrael shari loved kochavim asur. I was sitting in front of Rav Achabar Yaakov when he proposed this inference, and I wanted to say to him, what, could there really be something that would be kosher for a Jew but prohibited for a Gentile? V'lo amrele, but I didn't say it to him, damina hatamat amar, because I assumed he knew what he was talking about. Right, he must have had a reason for what he said. So that's Rav Papa. He comes in, right, introduces this principle, this mi'ikamide de l'Yisrael shari ulo v'in kochamim asor. Could there really be something that would be permitted for a Jew but forbidden for a Gentile, right? We know Jews theoretically, right, have Taryag mitzvot, have many more obligations and commandments incumbent upon us, and therefore, right, it should be harder to be a Jew. So there seems to be something kind of counterintuitive and maybe even kind of internally contradictory about the notion that it might be permitted for a Jew to eat these b'nei me'ayim, but asur for a Gentile. Before we jump into Tosafot and the question that they ask, we're going to take a quick look at a parallel sugya, or the sugya in Sanhedrin. If you were there in Daf Yomi when we covered Sanhedrin, it's also a pretty famous sugya, which discusses the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. And in its discussion of the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, this principle, Mika midi de Yisrael shari ulovid kochavim masor, shows up there, and it will provide us a way to see a little bit more of the nuances and the details of that principle. So, Gemara in Sanhedrin, right? Amar mar kol mitzvah shene'emra livnei Noach v'nishneit l'Sinai l'zel l'zen ne'emra livnei Noach v'lo nishneit l'Sinai l'Yisrael ne'emra v'lo livnei Noach. So, a bunch of the mitzvot that were originally said to b'nei Noach and then were said again at Sinai. So, to those mitzvot, according to this Tana, are incumbent upon both b'nei Noach and b'nei Israel. So, lo tirtzach, for example, the isur of eshet ish, the prohibitions of murder and adultery, right, were said to, or more broadly, to all of b'nei Noach before Matan Torah, and then they were repeated at Matan Torah. Those apply equally to both Gentiles and to Jews. But livnei Noach v'lo nishneit b'Sinai l'Yisrael ne'emra v'lo livnei Noach. So anything that was said to b'nei Noach and was not repeated at Sinai, and the example I believe in the sugya there is Gid HaNasheh, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. It's not totally clear that Gid HaNasheh was ever a mitzvah for b'nei Noach. Right, that is considered to be a mitzvah incumbent upon Yisrael and not incumbent upon b'nei Noach. Then the Gemara responds, Adarabba, midelo nishnei b'Sinai livnei Noach ne'emra v'lo Yisrael. Right, I would think the opposite. I would think that if a mitzvah was commanded to b'nei Noach and then wasn't restated at Sinai, right? If it only applies to one group, either Gentiles or to Jews, I would think it would apply to Gentiles. To which the Gemara responds, "Leka midam de Yisrael shari l'nochri asur." Right? It can't be that there is something that would be permitted to a Jew and forbidden to a Gentile. So that's the principle, right? Some version of the principle that Rav Papa articulated, right? And given that, then if it only applies to one group, it's going to apply to the Jews and not to the Gentiles. But then the Gemara, right, provides a counterexample. V'lo v'harei Yeshivat Torah, right? Isn't there? What about the dispensation? Let's put it that way, of Eshet Yeshivat Torah, right? The captive woman, who, according to Sefer Devarim, right, when a woman is taken captive during the process of kibush Eretz Yisrael, that Sefer Devarim describes, right? If a soldier finds a captive woman and wants to take her to his house, there's a certain process that he has to go through. He has to marry her. But the way that Chazal understand that mitzvah is that is that it's a special dispensation or a special heter for eshet ish. Right? The woman is married, theoretically, right, and under all other circumstances, an eshet ish is asura. Despite that, the woman is permitted to the man under certain circumstances. And that applies to Jews and doesn't apply to Gentiles. Gentiles are forbidden from, right? The prohibition of eshet ish applies equally to Jews and Gentiles, or apply maybe with slight differences in details, but applies to both Jews and Gentiles. And that dispensation doesn't exist. So there's something that's permitted for a Jew and forbidden for a Gentile. The Gemara answers Hata mishum delav b'nei kibushin. Right, that's because the Gentiles, right, the whole case from which the dispensation of Eshet Yeshivat Torah emerges in the first place is this process of kibush haaretz that the Sefer Devarim describes, and that, right, that whole process is not relevant to Gentiles, right? It's the Israelites who are conquering Eretz Yisrael there, and because of that, the dispensation of Eshet Yeshivat Torah doesn't apply to Gentiles because it's just not a relevant category for them, right? Because they're not subject to the to the circumstances that would give rise to this dispensation in the first place, right? So the reason that we end up in a situation where there's a chumrah for a Gentile and a kula for a Jew is only because again, they're not subject to the circumstances that would give rise to this heter. And then there's another counterexample that the Gemara brings. There's another exception, right? The other kind of famous exception to this principle is that a Gentile who steals less than a shavet pruta is punished for that, whereas a Jew is not. And the reason that the Gemara offers here is that the presumption is that the reason why they're stealing less than a shavet pruta is okay for Jews is because of some kind of mechila, the assumption that less than a shavet pruta people aren't particularly makpidan and are going to allow other people to take from them without it really mattering to them. And that wouldn't necessarily be true of Gentiles, but it's not a fundamental difference in the law that's stricter on Gentiles than it is on Jews. It's just that there's that same assumption or possibility of mechila just isn't applicable to them. Just real quick, going back up to the question of the mitzvot shene'emru leMoshe livnei Noach shene'emru livnei Noach v'nishnei b'Sinai, right? A mitzvah that was originally said to Bnei Noach and repeated at Sinai. Right? Why is it that the assumption in the Gemara seems to be lekamida v'Yisrael shari l'nochri asur? Why is it that there couldn't be something that would be harder for a Gentile than for a Jew, or more stringent on a Gentile than for a Jew? Rashi explains, when the revelation at Sinai that added the Taryag mitzvot, right, that made the Jewish people, right, really separate from the rest of humanity and separate from Gentiles, right? The presumption, right, that Rashi is understanding the Gemara to be working with is that lihit kadesh yatzu v'lo lehakel aleichem, right? That the process of adding more mitzvot was one of a kind of greater sanctity, but also a greater which requires a certain kind of like further separation and further kedusha, and that has to be something that is that requires more stringencies and not more kulas. Okay. With that, we can get into Tosafot on our sugya, right? So Tosafot here is actually referring to the end of the sugya, right? We said Reish Lakish, or Rav Acha bar Yaakov wants to read into Reish Lakish something that would result in a kula for a Gentile and a chumrah for Jews. And Tosafot here, right, notices that at the end of the sugya, right, the determination, right, of a different Amora is that both Jews and Gentiles, right, that for both Jews and Gentiles, these b'nei me'ayim are mutari, right, so that they're right, the law ends up being equal for both of them. And Tosafot says that right? Sounds like the reason why that would be the case, right? Why would it be that we paskin against Rav Acha bar Yaakov there at the end of the sugya? Because it seems like on some level Rav Papa was right? There actually isn't anything that Dil Yisrael Shari Lo'ovid Kochavim Asur, right? That it sounds like that principle wins the day, right? That principle that we mentioned in Sanhedrin and that Rav Papa mentioned in our sugya really does sort of win the day, or that's what's going on at the end of the sugya. But then Tosafot says, "V'tema de beperek arba mitot parif v'ha'ika yuvat tower umishane shane ovei kochavim delav b'nei kibush." But if you remember back to the sugya in Sanhedrin, right? The sugya in Sanhedrin already brought a counterexample and explained why the counterexample made sense, right? The counterexample of Yifat Toar it brought in Sanhedrin and explained that the circumstances which give rise to this heter, right, those initial circumstances just aren't relevant to Gentiles, and therefore the heter would, as a sort of corollary of that, wouldn't be relevant to Gentiles. Tosafot says, "Hachanami," right here too, you could say the same thing. Right? You could say the same thing, that the reason why this kula, right, the kula of the bnei me'ayim emerges from the circumstances of shlita, right, and there's those circumstances of shlita which initially are a chumrah, right? Jews have to eat meat that's been shechted, that's a chumrah, and then because of the process and the nature of shlita, right, that ultimately ends up resulting in a specific kula, but that doesn't mean that the Torah or God was more lenient with Jews than it was with Gentiles. It just means that due to a particular set of laws or rules that are actually essentially more difficult for Jews to maintain than for Gentiles, um, emerges one particular corollary of that ends up being a kula. So Tosfot says, well, why don't we take that same kind of the same argument basically from Sanhedrin and graft it onto this example here. Great, we can paskin la halacha that lakamidi de Yisrael shari loved kochavi masor, that kind of as a broad principle, that broad principle stands, and yet we could say that our case was an exception. Tosfot doesn't actually answer this question. At some level, it sounds like Tosfot thinks that Rav Papa's kushya really was a kushya that could have been answered. The Gemara and the Gemara on some level didn't really answer it, and instead a later Amora at the end of the sugya seems to basically accept his kushya. Tosfot's not really sure why that is. Bothered why our sugya doesn't include the same kind of back and forth, same answer it offered in Sanhedrin, that Shani Oved Kochavim Delav B'nei Ex Ninhu. Because could have been the same right here. The Rashba, interestingly enough, offers a very similar interpretation, but actually wants to read that into the text of the back and forth with Rav Papa, of the internal dialogue with Rav Papa himself. So the Rashba on Amina Hata'ama Kamar, right? If you remember back, Rav Papa said, I heard Rav Acha bar Yaakov saying this. I wanted to say, how could that be? How could we have a kula for Gentiles? But I said, Hata'ama Kamar. He must have a reason for what he was saying. Kulomar, says the Rashba. What did he mean by Hata'ama Kamar? V'kevan de Tama Kamar lo shayach lememar mi'ika de mi'ika midi kedam rinan b'Sanhedrin. Right? There's a reason not to say mi'ika midi. There's a reason not to use this principle of there's nothing more stringent for Gentiles than for Jews. Kedam b'Sanhedrin lakamidem d'Yisrael shari l'nochri asur parich v'harei fatar d'Yisrael shari l'nochri asur mashani hata mishum d'lav b'nei kibush. Right. So again, quoting that sugya in Sanhedrin and saying that the reason why Eshet Yifat Torah seems like an exception to the rule is because there's a kind of more general category to which the Gentiles are not subject. So it sounds like under certain, right, there are going to be exceptions to this rule when there's a good reason. And that actually what's going on when Rav Papa says, Amina hata amar kamar, he must have a good reason, is that Rav Papa must be saying, sounds like this, right, it sounds like the particular rules of Shchita and their application to the B'nai Me'ayim, right, actually would be similar to the Eshet Yifat Torah exception in that it's something that seems like an exception, but there's a reasonable explanation for why there would be that exception and why the rule could still stand. So on some level, according to the Rashba, right, our sugya basically offers the same answer as is offered in the sugya in Sanhedrin via this Hata'ama Kamar, right? That back and forth that we see in Sanhedrin, that there's some version of it at least kind of echoing at least in Rav Papa's mind in our sugya, whereas Tosfot thinks that our sugya doesn't consider the possibility raised in the sugya in Sanhedrin, right? That actually maybe the case of Shlita could be an exception to this rule. Doesn't really know why and is left without an answer. Okay, all of that is our sugya. Now I think we're going to take a look at a little bit more of this Tosafot in terms of going back to kind of broadly speaking the principle of leka midam de Yisrael shari and then a couple of the other possible ways to challenge that principle and answers to it. And we're going to see a couple of nafkaminot lahalacha. So Tosafot ve'ein lahakshot mehada amar b'perek arba mitot avei kochavim shavat chayav v'chein ha'osek b'Torah. So there are a couple of other exceptions, things that are asur, things that seem like exceptions, things that are prohibited for Gentiles but permitted for Jews. For example, here Shabbat and Talmud Torah, right? That the Gemara back in Sanhedrin also prohibits Gentiles from keeping Shabbat or learning Torah. Tosafot says this isn't a challenge to our broad principle that lekamiti de Yisrael shari le'ovikochavim masor. Why? To davar shehu mitzvah Yisrael lasot lo shayach lemevar mi'ika miti de Yisrael shari. Right. The reason why these are different is that these aren't things that are permitted for Jews. These are things that Jews have to do. They're mitzvot for Jews. And that, right, there's nothing, there's nothing that's prohibited to Gentiles but permitted for Jews. But it is possible, says Tosafot, to prohibit a Gentile from doing something that a Jew is commanded to do, right? That certain mitzvot, right, belong to the Jewish people in particular, and that to say that there's something sort of special about the relationship between God and God's people, with regard to the commandments, that the Jews were commanded, right? That's not going easier on the Jews than it is going on the Gentiles. It's saying that, right, this is something particular to the covenant between God and the Jewish people, and that there's some value in the exclusivity of those mitzvot. Tosfos bringing another perhaps counterexample here. The Afagav de Benach Neherag al Ubarim Keda Amar Hatam v'Yisrael no Neherag. So if this comes up in contexts around halachic conversations around abortion, but fetuses of a certain stage, the penalty for abortion, right, of a fetus at certain stages, for a Jew and a Gentile, will be different and actually be more strict for a Gentile that for a Gentile we consider to be kind of like killing a human, whereas for Jews it's not necessarily. That might also seem to be an exception to this rule, right? It's something that's more strict, a commandment that seems to be more strict for Gentiles than for Jews. Tosfot's response is nihida patur mikol makom lo shari, right? Just because a Jew is not necessarily, right, punished as severely doesn't necessarily mean it's permitted. And the question of midam de Yisrael shari oved kochavim asur is about permitting something for Jews that's prohibited for Gentiles. And a difference in punishment isn't necessarily saying that, oh, the Torah is going softer on the Jews than it is going on the Gentiles, as much as it's right, the set of punishments for violating the Noahide laws is just a narrower set of punishments, and sometimes what that ends up meaning is that the punishments are going to be stricter. So there's nothing prohibited to Gentiles but permitted to Jews, but there might be areas where the punishment for a Gentile is more severe. Ad kan Tosfot. Now we're going to look at two different kind of interesting halachic nafkaminot as to right, that sort of emerge from this principle and that really get at, I think, a broader and more interesting question about the relationship between Jews and God's covenant with all of humanity, and the extent to which the Jewish people are part of that covenant as well, part of that covenant primarily, and then the Jewish identity is sort of supplemental to that. So the Minchat Chinuch explores the question of the possible p'tor of a suma, of a blind person, from the mitzvot, right? This is a machloket Tanaim. It's a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, and that, right, this might be a famous story if the famous story about Rav Yosef, the blind Amorah, who at first thought that it would be better if the halacha were like Rabbi Yehuda, because hey, then I'd be patur and I keep all the mitzvot anyway. And then I learned that gadol mitzvah ve'oseh misheino mitzvah ve'oseh, and then I really hoped that the halacha was not like Rabbi Yehuda. So anyway, famous shita of Rabbi Yehuda that a suma is patur min mitzvot. There's a machloket achronim about whether or not that means that he is patur from only mitzvot aseh or also from mitzvot lo ta'aseh. And the Minchat Chinuch is going to explore the question according to the shita that Rabbi Yehuda is poter suma even from mitzvot lo ta'aseh. What does that mean about mitzvot b'nei Noach? Mikol makom, so I'm reading from the fourth line here. Mikol makom nearly af im nomar de Rabbi Yehuda poter afiu lavin, right? Even if Rabbi Yehuda thinks that a suma is exempt even from lavin, mikol makom otan mitzvot shebnei Noach muzhar hu gam ken muzhar. Of course, he's still chayav in mitzvot b'nei Noach. Denihida haTorah lo chila oto b'Sinai, aval lo yatsa lahakel b'ma shehaya chayav kodem. Right, it's true that from Sinai, right, according to Rabbi Yehuda's position, this person wasn't commanded any of the additional commandments at Sinai, but he wasn't exempt from what he had been chayav beforehand, right? We know that there's no special dispensation for blind Gentiles. Of course, blind Gentiles also have to keep Shev Mitzvot B'nai Noach, so why should a blind Jew be any different? Right, because of again this principle really that the lekamidi de B'nai Noach asur. B'nai Noach asur liYisrael shari. They can't be something that this blind Jew, that because he's a Jew now he's allowed to steal. Right? That doesn't make any sense. So he takes the principle and learns from it about that the on some level this individual is still part of the kind of covenant of God with humanity, right? And the P'tor is a particular P'tor that doesn't add any of the mitzvot that the Jews were commanded, but doesn't detract from what he had been commanded before. The Minchat Asher of Rav Asher Weiss, he disagrees with that opinion of the Minchat Chinuch. Why? That he is Mikom Makom Chayav b'mitzvot shebnei Noach chayav shebnei Noach chayav behem delo gar me'akum ein sham. Now on the third line, Ach gam ze ein nir eli b'Yisrael. I don't think this makes sense, says Rav Asher. Dehalo eino akum eli Yisrael gamor. Right? He's not a Gentile. He's a Jew. Right? And okay, once he he's patur from the mitzvot of Yisrael, then why would he be chayav mitzvot of bnei Noach? The taryag mitzvot Yisrael inam tosafot al mitzvot bnei Noach el adin acher legamre. Right, he thinks something totally different, and that this is based on this Gemara and Sanhedrin on some level, that the chiyuv even of bnei Yisrael in the mitzvot of bnei Noach is a separate chiyuv, right? It's not that we're part of the covenant of humanity and then have 613 minus 6 mitzvot added on to that. No. Also, those 6 mitzvot bnei Noach were commanded not qua Jews, not qua Gentiles, or not qua humans, were commanded qua Israel, right? Once the covenant at Sinai sort of replaced the covenant with for the Jewish people, the covenant at Sinai replaced the covenant with all of humanity, and as such, a Jew is commanded as a Jew and not commanded as a human being. And because of that, once there's a P'tor of all of the mitzvot, including Lavin, so that would apply also to the mitzvot that happen to be that Jews happen to have in common with bnei Noach. So that's this machloka between the Minchat Chinuch and between Rav Asher Weiss, and we can see in that even echoes of maybe a broader, more theological question about how is the commandedness of the Jewish people part of or kind of supplemental to the covenant that God has with all of humanity, or is it something else entirely? I'm going to look at one other potential halachic nafkamina, and that is the question of whether a ben da'at who is not bar mitzvah yet, right? So someone who is a katan but is totally conscious and in control of and responsible for his actions, right? Whether he would be obligated the same as an adult when it comes to the isurin of ben Noach, and the particular case that's talked about here is murder. So ולפי זה יש לחלק במצוות שנצטוו בני נוח גם בישראל הקטנים שהגיעו לכלל דעה איסור הרע מעליו. So when it comes to the mitzvot of bnei Noach, says the Or Sameach, I'm reading the Or Sameach here, the commentary on the Rambam, a 19th century commentary on the Rambam, that when it comes to mitzvot bnei Noach, a child who has reached the age, who has reached kind of a conscious and responsible age, is also chayav in the mitzvot of bnei Noach. And he bases this Kmoshe Amru b'Mechilta k'yotzei b'zeh ish l'hotzi et hakatan, right? Isi ben Yehuda Omer kodem matan Torah haynu musarin al shchut damim la'achar matan Torah tachat shu meru v'glu. Right, we know that there's this rule that only adults are chayav, right? Ish l'hotzi et hakatan, chayav on murder, and then Isi ben Akiva comes and says, wait, how could that be? There are a whole number of particular cases of particular murder halachot that actually are seem to be more stringent on bnei Noach than on Yisraelim. And Isi ben Akiva is sort of is a little bit disturbed by that, based on the same principle, what seems to be the same principle, like amidam di Yisrael shari lo v'kochavim asur. Right, the ubar that we talked about, the fetus, was one example that we saw earlier. The Perushim, and this is how the Or Sameach is explaining this. Right, obviously it has to be, but it can't be that the Torah is now going easier on us now that we were commanded at Sinai. That can't be. That's what Isi ben Akiva is saying. Rak linyan onshim, right? Though all of these examples, they only apply to the question of onshim. They only apply to the question of punishments. That, for example, right, im avar v'asat tfei chaser rachman al dam Yisrael. Okay, fine. That sure that it might be that under certain circumstances the punishment for Jews will be less stringent. And under certain circumstances, right, the punishment will be less severe, right? And for example, if the murderer is a child, right, that a Jewish child does not get the death penalty for murder, but that doesn't mean that a Jewish child is permitted to murder. If a Gentile child is forbidden to murder, it can't possibly be that a Jewish child is permitted to. Okay, so it must really the only way we can explain this is that it's merely about punishment, similar to what Tosafot said, and that really another kind of halachic nafka mina, he's in line in this sense with the minchat chinuch. It seems that that Yisraelim, right, the Torah came to add an extra layers of extra kedusha and extra commandedness, but really we are still part of the commandedness, the kedusha, the commandedness and the covenant that all of humanity have, and it can't be that we've been taken out of that by virtue of the particular relationship that the Jewish people have with God. I'll close with bringing it kind of less away from the halachic questions and into a slightly more theological direction, right? Some Jewish thought here. Rav Yosef Albo, a medieval Jewish philosopher, in his Sefer HaIkarim talks about right, adat al shalosh panim im tiv'it im nimusit im elohit, right? He talks about sort of three different levels of norms that we're subject to, that human beings and Jews are subject to. Right, right, there's some kind of natural law that is common to all of humanity in all time and across time and place. Hanimusit, which I would probably best translate in this context, right, as culture. Right, so everyone's subject to cultural, socio-cultural norms in the world in which we live, and that's right. It's not going to be common to all of humanity across time and place, but is going to be particular to the socio-cultural context that we're a part of. And actually, it's interesting that he places Noach, right, that he places this, right, even the religious norms, he places something that's really something that is all of humanity can be a part of. But he says, right, there's a particular version of that that is the particular covenant that Bnei Israel have with God, right? That religion is a layer on top of the kind of more basic sets of norms that humanity is subject to, right? Something about this picture aligns with the picture of the Minchat Chinuch and of the Or Sameach. Whereas the picture that the Rambam is going to paint here is actually a little bit different and maybe more in line with that of Rav Asher, or with that of the Minchat Asher. Right, Simli b'chal ha'ikar ha'gadol. Right, this is in his Perushim Mishnah. In Chullin al ha'ikar ha'gadol ha'nichla b'Mishnah azot v'hi ma she'amar misinai ne'esar lefi she'ata haret aladat shekol ma she'anu marchikim o osim hayom ein anu osin ela b'mitzvah HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yedei Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom v'lo she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu mar zel nevi'im shelefanav. Even mitzvot b'nei Noach, says the Rambam, we do not qua b'nei Noach, right? Not as human beings broadly construed, but as Israelites, right? We are commanded in the mitzvot b'nei Noach, we're commanded lo tirtzach, not because all humans are commanded lo tirtzach, but because we are, right, the Jews are in a special covenantal relationship with God that also happens to include the same mitzvot that all of the rest of humanity are a part of, right? So it's not that we've got humanity, a part of which are the Jews with the particular relationship with God that they have, but that there is the rest of humanity and the Jewish people, right, in kind of parallel covenants that happen to have some overlap. But insofar as we're commanded in those things that have overlap with the Gentiles, it's not as humans, but it's as Jews. So just to kind of sum up, right, we explored some halachic questions, right? The halachic nafkaminot here, right, are the blind, according to that one understanding of Rabbi Yehuda's position, and kind of responsible and conscious children obligated in the Noahide laws, right? Those are the halachic nafkaminot of the question. But really the conceptual question that's at stake here is, are Jews obligated in the Noahide laws qua human beings or only qua Jews? Right. And that really is maybe about a more essential theological question, right? Is Jewishness supplemental to our identity as human beings, or does it replace that identity? Thank you so much, and have a great week. See you next week.